Resuming debate, Senator Housakos, followed by Senator Deacon, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable colleagues, in my 13 years in the Senate of Canada, I don't think I have risen on a more important debate and issue than this one. I want to remind all senators in this chamber that our fundamental role when we were summoned to this place is to be the voice of our regions, to be the voice of minorities in this country. Voices that need to be heard, voices that need to be represented when they feel they're not being adequately represented, particularly in the other side, but also when they feel that they're being trampled on by the executive branch of government. There's no role more important in this place than the role of oversight of this institution on the government. And in this particular instance, we see a government where 1 minute these protesters, convoys were coming to Ottawa and they were marginalized by the Prime Minister. He called them a fringe minority. And the next minute, this fringe minority, the small group of Canadians that are anti-vaxxers and anti-mandates, all of a sudden became such a threat that we had to impose something that's been done in this country only 3 times before in the history of this country. So clearly, from that admission, the Prime Minister was wrong when he called this group a fringe group, a minority. Colleagues, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that it wasn't a fringe group. It isn't a fringe group. This country is deeply divided like I've never seen in my 50-plus years. I'm a proud Canadian. I've seen governments come and go. We've seen many crises in public discourse in the country, but never in my lifetime have I seen the deep divisions. And it's moments like this when the executive branch of government has an obligation, and every Prime Minister has an obligation to put the nation's interest above the interests of himself, his party, and partisan politics. I saw that many times under the leadership of Stephen Harper. I saw it firsthand in his caucus. I saw it under the leadership of former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, who I always appreciated. He put the nation first, regardless of political differences at various times, and God knows he had some very tough crossroads to manage in this country. I saw that under the leadership of Brian Mulroney as well. I know there's always a temptation on the part of politicians to wedge, to divide for political benefit, and I've seen firsthand that it works. But in these moments of an existential crisis, all Prime Ministers are obligated to bring the parties together, not to throw fuel on the fire, not to call protesters names, not to call them extreme right or extremists or racists or a few other words I won't even mention. We've had this debate and there's no point to revisit it. That kind of political posturing is completely unnecessary. And we saw this government do it in the last general election where they tried to create the atmosphere of them versus us. Somebody did some polls. So they realized, wow, 80% of Canadians are double vaxxed. So we'll make an example of the 20% of Canadians that don't want to be vaxxed, or are vax hesitant, or have medical conditions, or have a phobia, or whatever the reasons may be. I believe in freedom, yes. I believe in freedom of a man and a woman to choose if they take a medical procedure. It's their choice in this country. Before you go for a surgery, they ask you to sign a form, a waiver. I don't think it's much to ask in this country as a Canadian citizen to have your governments lay off when it comes to taking vaccines or medications or medical procedures, or being forced to have or not have an abortion. It's the same type of debate for me as a libertarian. These are rights that should be fundamental in the country. So when these protesters come to Ottawa, there should be consistent rules for all Canadians. I'm double vaxxed. I try to persuade my friends, my neighbors, everybody. I believe it's genuinely the way to go in order to mitigate this disease and fight it to the best of our ability. But I also recognize the right of somebody else not to be vaxxed. I recognize the right of somebody to expect their government to be fair with all citizens, to be just with all citizens. So when protesters come to Ottawa, or they go to Coutts, or they go to Quebec City, or they go to Toronto, they have the right of protest. It's fundamental in our democracy, and nobody can take that away. But you know what? When protesters went to the G20 a few years back, they had the legitimate right to protest. When Indigenous communities had legitimate issues with the government, they went to the extreme with armed protests shutting down infrastructure and railway crossings in this country for a number of weeks. When Black Lives Matter protests for issues that are important, they're fundamentally on the right side of where they should be on it. And every politician has the right to respect these protests. We have an obligation, particularly as parliamentarians, as a prime minister, whoever it is, to dialogue with these people. Somebody said earlier in their speech that the 3 R's are the most important thing in our democracy: rights, responsibilities, and respect. I think it was Senator Arnott, and I agree with him. It's a right to protest in this country. It's a responsibility, though, of Parliament and our Prime Minister and our governments to dialogue with these citizens. These are not enemies of the state. These are frustrated Canadians. If it's Black Lives Matter, if it's the Indigenous communities, if it's people at a G20 for economic reasons. We saw what happened in my province of Oka many years ago. I'm old enough to remember. And in all those instances, prime ministers threw water on the fire, they dialogued, they sent ministers in for discussions, they sent bureaucrats in to have chats with these people, trying to figure out what the problem was. They didn't say, you're undesirables, you're racists, you march with swastikas, you're tearing down monuments when when they didn't tear down monuments. We've had other protests in this country which desecrated monuments across the country, which burned down religious centers of worship. The Prime Minister didn't run out to invoke the Emergencies Act. He dialogued. So why in this instance did he choose to do otherwise? Is it because maybe he thought the poll numbers were on his side? Maybe he thought he'd get away once again of trying to create the us majority versus them, the minority? And then all of a sudden he started realizing even us double-vaxxed people are frustrated in this country. We're frustrated with mandates that are not fair. For example, when a government institutes a travel mandate, they should institute a travel mandate. But no, there's a double standard with the policies of this government. So if you're a wealthy Canadian and you need to go see a family member in New Jersey or California, not a problem. Hop on a plane, you do your PCR test, you come back, you quarantine, life's a dream. If you have a sick mother in Vermont, for example, and you're in Montreal and you need to go visit your sick mom, you can't get over the border because of COVID, because of mandates. We got to do this. We got to save the country. But of course, if you sit back and think about it, so the sacrifices are going to be done for those who can't afford to get on a plane and drive over a border, and those who can fly, well, you're good. More double standards. We have a case in point where we had protests at Coots, we had protests at the Ambassador Bridge. Governments, police authorities there were able to bring down the temperature. They were able to resolve that issue. Nobody called the Prime Minister and said, give us the Emergencies Act or else we can't get it done. So Cité du Québec and the police authorities in Quebec City, they planned for the protests effectively. They calmed things down. They dealt with it appropriately. There was no need for emergency measures. So this is the kind of irresponsible behavior on the part of the government that just can't be excused. It just cannot be. This Prime Minister has tripled down for political expediency and nothing else when he saw that he was losing. And to this day, he hasn't once taken any responsibility for this issue. The other element, colleagues, is this thing could have been resolved very quickly if this government would have done or is willing to do what governments across this country have been doing now for over a week, announcing that they are removing mandates. It was the easiest thing. Alberta did it, Saskatchewan did it, Ontario did it, the Quebec government did it. The only one who has tripled down and is refusing to eliminate those mandates is Prime Minister Trudeau. And at this point, we see there's no good reason for it, except he doesn't want to acknowledge political defeat. This isn't a game. This is about bringing the country that's deeply divided together. This is about reconciliation after coming out of a terrible, terrible crisis called COVID. And by the way, colleagues, make no mistake about it, this is just the beginning of disruption, because the next crisis around the corner is fundamentally worse. And this Prime Minister has buried his head in the sand regarding that one as well, and I'll get to that towards the end. But he's invoked an emergency measure, which again was unnecessary, given the police and police authorities in this country overkill, overarching authority, essentially, to do essentially what they want without any accountability to anybody. And the government leader yesterday pretty much said to us that, trust me, trust the government. There's enough evidence to justify this. I haven't seen it. He acknowledged that he hasn't seen it. I think Senator Tanis asked him about it. We haven't seen it, but the Parliament of Canada, trust me, we can freeze accounts. We can give the police all this authority to take care of what it seems to me they should be able to take care of with our present laws. And if the present laws on the books aren't sufficient to manage a few protesters in Ottawa and on Parliament Hill, we're lawmakers. Let's change the laws. Let's not tell the government, take over, be a dictatorship. Come to Parliament and say this is what we need, and we need it quickly. As you've seen, Senator Gold, we are very agile in this place over the last 2 years. Everything you've asked of your colleagues in the Senate, we've done relatively quickly. You need billions of dollars, we approved them. We need changes in order to deal with COVID, we've dealt with them, even when we had reservations. We haven't pushed back. There hasn't been any hesitation. But telling police officers, go ahead and you decide who enters your parliamentary precinct, you make a list of who's appropriate to enter and who's not, I find that unbelievable. And yes, local residents were inconvenienced in a big way. Unfortunately, the frustration of Canadians has reached such a boiling point where, yes, they're causing chaos in the streets. That should be a red alert that we should sit down and find out how we can address them. That's our job. Foreign investment in this country in the last few days since the Emergency Measures Act has basically come to a standstill. We've seen it. You've seen the stats now. And it's even worse than it was before the Emergency Measures Act, which was pretty pitiful. Foreign investment in this country is at the lowest level it's been in 7 years, 8 years. So when we become the laughingstock of other Western democracies, when we're all over the front page news in the UK, in the United States, in France, in Germany, where I'm getting calls from parliamentarians and friends saying, what's happening to your great democracy? And I have no answer. I can't explain it. I can't explain that a few 100,000 people in Ottawa overcame the laws of this country, our police forces and our public security system, that we had to invoke a measure that was invoked only 3 other times in the history of this country. World War I, World War II, and of course, the October crisis. And colleagues, in each and every one of those cases where that act was invoked, history has proved there was indiscretions. History has proved that we made mistakes. We wronged people in a serious way, where governments later on had to stand up in this place and the other and apologize for those indiscretions. So it's not good enough, colleagues, to say, trust the government. It's not the role of the Senate or the House of Commons to trust the government. That's for the people to decide during elections if they want to trust them or don't trust them. This place, our job is to question them, is to see the facts before we're forced to vote on certain things. Now, we also have a Prime Minister, in addition to calling people names, he has another talent. He likes to reinvent things. Like all of a sudden, the government leader in the Senate has become the representative. Partisanship has become an evil thing in public debate. Independent parliamentarian is a parliamentarian that rubber stamps their political program and their government agenda. Extremists, racists, extreme right wing. These are all code words for anybody who opposes us. We're going to tag you. We're going to put an etiquette on you. That's, like I said, politically very astute. It's worked very well so far. I think it's slowly catching up to him. And colleagues, Prime Minister Trudeau said at the beginning of this crisis, we're all in this together. That's what he said. He said, we're going to be in this together. Unless, we have your back. But unless you're a trucker. If you're a trucker, you're on your own. Unless you're not willing to accept a medical procedure. If you're unwilling to take a vaccine, you're on your own in a big way. Unless you can't afford to fly on an airplane, you're going to be locked in your house and quarantined by this government because somehow there's different rules for those that can get on a plane and different rules for those that are going by with 4 wheels because they can't afford to do otherwise. I'm seeing, colleagues, unfortunately, this dangerous thing developing in our country, and it's called the bureaucratic oligarchy, where people like us, we have the privilege of a paycheck every couple of weeks, guaranteed. We have, as do all those who work for government agencies across this country. So during this COVID crisis, we saw, yeah, the government had the back of all those people. Our employees were working from home. We found ways to accommodate them. Our employees, we made sure that their paychecks were on time. So there wasn't as big a hit as those other citizens who are not part of the bureaucratic oligarchy like I am. I have that privilege. Other citizens who actually have to work in the private sector, who have been hit with a 30% pay cut, who unfortunately have lost their jobs and they're starting to feel the pain. So colleagues, all I have to say in conclusion is the following, that we have an obligation to make sure that this divided country has some reconciliation, comes together and recognize that we have to represent the interest of all Canadians in dealing with this crisis. Because now we're getting through the crisis of COVID, but the next one, and you all see it, go to your grocery store, and it's $200 to buy a roast to feed a family of 3 or 4. Again, the bureaucratic oligarchs, us privileged, we can afford it.
Housakos, but your time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Deakin, Nova Scotia.